Tim Pool say something stupid. My God. No, don't be ridiculous. He's gonna say something extremely stupid. No. Okay, let's get into this. I feel like I take radiation damage when I watch videos like this, because it's one thing to watch something that's slightly ignorant, or people who like tried, but when you watch people who don't try, and Tim Pool is somebody who doesn't try, and that's something that gets under my nerves. It's the same thing that really hurt me about watching the Breaking Point stuff, is watching people who don't try, or people who have like a few puzzle pieces they have like 3 out of 100 puzzle pieces necessary to see the picture, so they just put the 3 there and then they start jamming in other puzzle pieces that don't fit. And that's what it feels like sometimes watching Tim Pool speak. That's what it sometimes feels like watching Breaking Point speak, is people doing their best to use the little bit of knowledge they have to try to string it together into some sort of narrative. And when it's that, like when you have those few pieces of information and they're that kind of like separated from each other, you do have a lot of room to just kind of intersplice and interject in between whatever you want. So I was scrolling on Twitter, as often people do, or X as the regime wants to call it. Twitter, X, or whatever you call it, but dead name or not. I was scrolling and then I saw this video come up in my feed. We're not going to watch it now. We're going to watch the full thing in its original context, but I just want you guys to know where I saw it. And when I saw this clip, and we'll get to it eventually in the video, it just felt so performative. It just felt so ridiculous. It just felt so silly. But of course, because of the things that were said in it, in the context of what's happening in the war right now, it felt so disgusting that I felt like I had to kind of react to this on stream. Because I don't talk about Tim Pool that much. I've talked about him a bit on the channel. Not like never at all, but a decent amount of times, I guess. I don't know what a decent would be. 7, 8 maybe? In like 3, 4 years of making content. But this one really threw me for a loop, because it was just... It left me feeling like he just wanted to become a Russian stooge for this oomph or contrarianism. The useful idiot, I don't think so. Maybe. But more than anything, I came away from this thinking that he was ignorant. And that just, it hurt. So we're gonna watch. We're gonna watch the original video. Who's ready for the New World Order? The Klaus Schwab dollar. Okay, let's go. Let's watch.
We've got huge news from Politico. Ukraine's incursion into Russia could change everything, Mark Kelly says. This really set Putin back on his heels, he said of Russia's president. It really depends if China is ready to engage, to take Taiwan, and they want to go to war. If China stands back and lets this happen, I don't know what Russia can do, but Ukraine has invaded Russia. I think this is the scariest outcome we could have seen. Hindustan Times.
I would throw out that the idea of, after seeing Bucha, that the whole country just collapsing, like the country that just started the largest war in Europe, just winning overwhelmingly and only receiving the response basically from the result of the war and from a lack of international, reaction of, oh, this is a 100% successful strategy to employ in Europe in the 21st century. That, to me, is a scarier outcome. I think that is a much scarier outcome in my mind. Because when I think about perpetuating war into the future, or into a war that could be much, even bigger than this one, with states that have nuclear weapons, that is a scenario that scares me.
Not that I think is the greatest source or whatever. NATO rift over Ukraine, Kursk's incursion exposed. Italian deputy prime minister warns West of World War III. Yeah, here we go. Telegraph. World War III is closer than anyone dare admit. I mean, I've been talking about it.
Can I just say, what I really don't like about online commentary, I can understand if you have like an article on screen, just to have it on in the background to be like, we're talking about this topic, so here is something that's related to this topic that is on screen. Because sometimes I'm talking about something, it's like, what should I have on screen? Just like a looping video of Chinese soldiers marching if I'm talking about China for 20 minutes. But I really don't like having a commentary piece and from like the Telegraph or from the Guardian or from whoever, and it could be anybody in the world of any dispute. Is this guy like a general? Is this guy Samuel Romney? Is he like, oh my gosh, this is the dude who's been in deep with Ukrainian soldiers. He's been in deep with the Russians. He like diplomatically, he like, how in the know is he? And what evidence does he provide in these? Because most of the times when these opinion pieces are cited and they have these big quotes, it's from people that nobody knows, that are not in positions of authority. And I'm not trying to be mean to the authors. I'm just saying, like, nobody in Tim Pool's audience knows who Samuel is. I don't know who Samuel is. And then you don't read any of his arguments. And so all that's being said here, all that's being pushed here is the reinforcement of the idea that people are scared. People are scared of big war scared. If he was to stop and like read some of it, or even if he was to put in the effort to like surmise, like, here's like the evidence that they put forward, and like here it is, A, B, C, D, and like here's some paragraphs, be one thing. But just like this, I don't like this.
Ukraine has invaded Russia.
See, like we didn't even read any of it. It's just, oh my God, World War III is closer than you think. And then the next thing is Ukraine incursion into Russia. We're just jumping from article to article. We're not taking anything from it. If you just wanted to have this to say, look, Ukraine invaded Russia, it'd be one thing. But you were using a commentary piece, an opinion piece, to suggest World War III is closer than you think. And then didn't make any of the argumentation for it. Except for China and Taiwan, but you didn't really thread it. You just kind of dropped it at the start of it.
Let's pull this up. Let's pull up the map here. We're grabbing it, and we'll do Kursk.
Oh boy.
Russia.
Map time.
This is Ukraine invading Russian territory. Let me close this, drop this in. Okay. Kursk. Here's the map. Here's Ukraine, and they have invaded this territory of Russia. It's kind of hard to see, but here's the border of Ukraine. They've now invaded Russia. I mean, we saw this coming. Do you think Russia is just going to sit back and say, Western forces are invading our country, we're going to do nothing?
Yeah, that's a real possibility. I think a lot of people don't realize that in crises like these, sometimes that's might be the only option. I mean, think of it from like, you're in the Kremlin perspective, you're Putin, and you have the vast majority of your forces dedicated to advancing in Pokrovsk right now. In the first time in a long time, you're advancing at a decent rate, like a kilometer, like a day, or like sometimes half a kilometer to a kilometer a day. That's doesn't sound like a lot in the grand scheme of things, but compared to like measuring it by, you know, like, oh my gosh, you took half of this apartment block in the last 72 hours. Yeah, it's quite an advancement. And Pokrovsk is quite a you know, an important rail line. But now the Ukrainians have opened up a new front, and they don't have enough troops to respond. They might, but they're going to have to use conscripts, which the home population's not going to like. They're going to have to pull troops from places like Kaliningrad, which does need some troops to defend it. I mean, the Russians already took 80% of the troops off the border with Finland, and they said that, you know, the NATO expansion of Europe was the reason that one of the reasons they started this war. And now they're pulling off the troops off of the new NATO countries. I mean, either there's something wrong with the internal logic not matching what is being stated, or and maybe it's a little bit of both, they're in a security crisis and they're trying to pull on every resource they can as already. And now they have a new front opened. It strains them to either force them to pull troops back, which is one decision they could make, but oh my gosh, now they're probably not going to take Pokrovsk. Or they can take troops from elsewhere, but that's going to come with societal repercussions, and it's not sustainable. And if they, you know, perpetuate this war into 2025, you know, are they going to have to go through another wave of mobilization? Which, I mean, the first wave of mobilization is the first time that Putin, you know, really saw, you know, real hurt or an impact to his image. And so the idea that Putin is now going to say, hey guys, we're now going to triple, quadruple, or massively increase mobilization right now, or we're now going to start nuking parts of Russia, or we're going to admit that we have failed to protect Russia in this way, it might make more sense for the Russians, and I think it's likely, to do nothing and try to bleed out the Ukrainian offensive before trying to push them back over the border. I mean, if they were to nuke Ukraine, what would the repercussions be of that? Since that's the one escalation ladder I think Tim is really talking about. Not like Belarusian inclusion of invasion, but nukes is the one thing we're talking about here. the Chinese would certainly not be buying Russian energy export anymore. Why? I mean, they have more of an interest than anyone else in the world. I mean, they have extreme interest, not more than anyone else in the world, but they have extreme interest in making sure that nuclear non-proliferation is guaranteed. They don't want to see India and Pakistan going to war, and those are two countries that would want that too, by the way, to not see the use of nuclear weapons normalized. The Chinese don't want to see the North Koreans, who they're trying to keep on a semi-leash, from being encouraged and saying, oh, using nukes for reunification of historical territory that I believe is ours, yeah, that's justifiable and allowed. And, I mean, if we use a nuke, that's dangerous, but what are the Americans going to do? Use the nuke back? And you know what? They very well likely would. And so they have an incentive to isolate Russia in that scenario. So does India. So does all of the other places Moscow wants to export to. Also, if Russia can just barely handle Ukraine, how are they going to handle all of Europe? How are they going to handle the United States? How are they going to handle that escalation? And so it's like, in this scenario, the Russians thinking, okay, we'll do our best here, but we'll see if we can bleed out the Ukrainian, is better than let's risk Armageddon for our state. Whatever the result will be, Russia will not be the winner. And I think that from that logic, the sense to Russian victory, or the pathway to Russian victory, has always been escalating up to the point that stops the West from getting more involved. Because the West gets more involved, that will be probably too much pressure for the state. So escalating to that point. So use of nuclear weapons goes over that. And it also isolates them from many of the trade partners that they need to function. Not to mention, like, if we assume that the Russians have no doubts as to if Putin was to give the order, that the order would even be followed. But that's a whole other conversation. Point is, when Tim says, what, they're going to do nothing? In comparison to what Tim is saying, yes, relatively speaking, the odds are they do nothing. They're redeploying troops from Kaliningrad, they're deploying conscripts, they're redeploying some troops from the Kharkiv area, they're redeploying air assets, they're doing things like that. But when we just jump straight to nukes and like World War III, it's, you know, it just feels like fear-mongering.
They've lost their minds. You vote for Kamala Harris, my friends. Don't be surprised if your sons are drafted. Don't be surprised if your daughters are drafted. The Democratic Party wants to...
If there is one constant about the Biden administration, is Biden's adherence to the escalation argument. And this comes from, some people say Jake Sullivan. I think a lot more of it's actually Lloyd Austin. But I think also it comes from Joe Biden being, you know, on the board for foreign issues in the Senate for a very long time, chairman of the board of foreign affairs in the Senate. I think it was the Senate Intelligence Committee. I forget the exact committee name. But I believe it was, he was Senate Affairs Chairman, Foreign Affairs Chairman. He has extensive experience with foreign policy, and I think that extensive experience has made him risk averse. So I think that risk aversion has kept him from going forward with what the Poles, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and others have wanted when it comes to long-range strikes and other decisions. Now, on the other end of that, you could say Trump is much more conciliatory maybe with Putin, and you could say that's one advantage for your side when it comes to not having World War III. But on the other hand of that, he's a complete flip-flop, and it's a D20 dice roll every morning to see if you're going to get conciliatory Trump or Rocket Man Trump. And having somebody engaging in nuclear diplomacy with that type of characteristic, just flip-flopping on these types of issues like he did in Syria, like that's something that's of more concern to me than the possibility of me being drafted to go fight in Ukraine. Not only because I'm going over to Ukraine anyway, but also because Joe Biden declared from the first day of the war that he was not going to send American sons and daughters over there to go fight. And for all of the destruction that has been caused, no American servicemen have.
To expand the draft to women. All of these single cat ladies,
they're going to expand the draft to women. Who's talking? I haven't heard this at all. Number one, I will say, okay, this is my belief. If we're going to have the draft, I do think it should be a universal draft. As in men, women, everybody. Definitely, since there are plenty of roles in the armed forces, in logistics, in drone piloting, and even for certain very skilled women in combat roles that women could fill. In a time of, national struggle and survival, I would not completely be uncomfortable with that. I think there should be exceptions, of course, but if you're going to have a draft, I do think it should be a universal draft. Now, that's my belief. It's not something I'm crusading for. It's just, if I was to manage a system top down, which I will never have that power, I do not believe, that's how I would write it out. It's not something I'm crusading for, in fact. But this is not something Democrats have talked about at all. This is just like, they're going to draft your daughters. I haven't heard of that.
Greatest thing in the world for the Western war machine. You know why? If you are a parent, if you're a woman who's pregnant, they're not sending you to fight. If you're a woman who has...
I mean, we haven't used the draft since Vietnam. And now we're saying, okay, I mean, like, even if we expanded the draft to women, we haven't used it since Vietnam. So what would that mean in the, like, change in, like, life of everyday people right now? It would only be in the event of, like, a major war that would be a change for anyone. And, like, in the instances where women are used, like, historically speaking, it's usually medical roles, cooking, and stuff of that sort. Like medic roles and stuff like that. I mean, that's what I also mostly see in Ukraine. Training roles sometimes, but very rarely. Of course, now it's getting a little bit more diverse, but I mean, this isn't even like a historical anomaly, women in the armed forces.
A young child, they can't send you to fight. If you're a young man, bye, you're first in line. Harry Sisson's going to be on the front lines. I'm not kidding. They're going to have him do some kind of PR role, frontline stuff, if it really comes down to the draft. He's young enough.
Why wouldn't I be the first one? I'm here. I'm already there doing stuff. Why wouldn't they first go to me? This is a real punch in the gut. Why can't I be the top tier, like, DNC shill propagandist in Ukraine?
He's perfect.
Shilling for Mr. Deep State.
For it. If World War III really does kick off, if Russia does expand this conflict, and then look,
what is all these ifs? He hasn't built the, like, ladder to, like, this is how World War III would break out, or here's how much it is increased, because there's so many elements here that have not been talked about. You can talk about the element of, now that Ukrainian troops are in Russia, Russia's territorial sovereignty is being infringed upon in some way, even if it's rightful infringement, and that, you know, violates its nuclear standard. But then you could also say, well, if they were to say it violates the nuclear standard, that would be a standard. It would be an admission of a crisis that currently the government and the Kremlin are doing everything, and they're telling the propaganda proxies to do everything to tamper down and keep down. Kind of hard to, like, on one hand, treat it as like a crisis is going to end the world, while also tampering it down on every level. It's kind of hard to balance those things. But also, like, the Russians do not want to engage in a nuclear confrontation with the West that spirals into World War III for all the Chinese reasons, for they don't want to confront this as a crisis. But if they were, wait 1 second, I got a notification. Give me a moment. Oh God, I forgot what point I was trying to make. I will just go back. But welcome, Operator Starsky. Hope you're doing well. Operator Starsky is a Ukrainian press officer in the chat. Hope you're doing well.
Bye. You're first in line. Harry Sisson's going to be on the front lines. I'm not kidding. They're going to have him do some kind of PR role, frontline stuff, if it really comes down to the draft. He's young enough. He's perfect for it. If World War III really does kick off, if Russia does expand this conflict, and then, look, I can give you a scenario.
Why, again, how, he doesn't explain, like, if he just throws out, like, oh my God, here's a bunch of articles saying, oh, World War III is likely. He doesn't explain any of the arguments of it, or any of the arguments in these articles. He just throws the headlines out there. It's just the vibe of fear. Doesn't make the argumentation. Because if he was to say, look, there's a scenario where Russia feels so threatened that they have to use a nuclear weapon, you could try to, like, lay out that scenario where that Putin's logic gets there. And it's not a very likely scenario, but you could do it. But you would have to weigh it against, number one, the Kremlin is trying to keep the crisis down low. They want to play down the crisis, so it's kind of hard to use a nuke and play it down. It's kind of hard to be like, hey guys, we just use a nuke, but don't worry about it. It's still not a crisis. We're still not a threat. Putin's truly keeping everything stable and safe, and it's not the crazy 90s anymore. Don't worry. Kind of hard to do that. That's the first problem. Second problem is the Russians are having enough trouble with the Ukrainians. Now they're going to fight the Poles, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Finns. The Russians already took 80% of the troops that they had on the Finnish border away. to go fight in this war. They had to take their troops out of Kaliningrad to go fight the Kursk incursion. Now they're going to fight all of Europe and threaten a war with all of Europe. Not even talking about the trade backlash that could stem from this. But also, there is an amount of flexibility that the Russians have afforded themselves through their own inconsistencies. See, the Russians say that all of Russia is Russia and that much of Ukraine is Russia, and that it's no different. That Kiev and, not Kiev, but that Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea, constitutionally, no different than Moscow. No different. It's treated the exact same. But we know that isn't the case. And we know that isn't the case because we see it from how the United States manages risk with its long-range weapons. We can use ATACMS in Crimea. We can use ATACMS in Donetsk and Luhansk and all these other places. You can't use ATACMS in Moscow. That's one standard that the United States sets that treats it differently. But it's not just the United States, it's also the Russians. Do the Russians send their conscripts into Donetsk and Luhansk or Zaporizhia and Kherson to do a lot of fighting? No. The standard is that the expectation is that since they're not paid as much and they didn't really sign up for it, they're just going to stay back in Russia and they're going to be away from the fighting. That at least has been the implicit standard, and it should be the current standing legal standard, even if it hasn't always been held up 100%. The Russians also treat it differently, the idea of strikes in occupied Ukraine and in Russia. They have treated recruitment different in occupied Ukraine and in Russia. They've treated so many things differently in occupied Ukraine and in Russia when it comes to investment and the dilapidation that has been allowed in Donetsk. And so since this has been like whittled down for what exactly like is Russia's territorial integrity, Ukraine going into Kursk, I mean, if Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson and all these places in Crimea were all supposed to be covered by, this territorial integrity, and then Ukraine bursts into Kursk, I mean, how different is it really for the regime for them to look the other way and say, I mean, we'll just get it back like everything else, compared to the other option, which is a nuclear confrontation with a force much mightier than you, with much more economic might, and you will have basically no allies because the Chinese are not going to join you on this death mission. So if Tim was to include all this context, I'd be like, okay, that's fine. If he was to read the article that he just threw up there, it'd be fine, but he does neither of these things.
Let's jump back to the map. Kursk gets invaded. Russia, here's a strategy. And I'm saying Russia could have a simple strategy. How do you force Ukraine to back off from the Kursk region? You attack Latvia. You've got Kaliningrad right here.
Oh, fuck. I'm sorry. One second. Sorry. Let me listen. What? Sorry. Let me, can I get like do I have like a Generalissimo hat? Oh, I don't have a Generalissimo. I don't want to put a shotgun on my shoulder for Twitch rules. Man, I don't have any really. Wait, this doesn't really fit me anymore. Because this is old. Super old. I got this old Romanian communist military jacket that I wore when I was very tiny. It was made for a man much tinier than me. But I will wear it for this moment. So the old Romanian regime, and by the way, the communist regime in Romania was so awful, morally corrupt, can give me the military knowledge necessary of their regime so that I can understand Tim Pool's logic.
It's invaded. Let's jump back to the map. Kursk gets invaded. Russia, here's a strategy. And I'm saying Russia could have a simple strategy. How do you force Ukraine to back off from the Kursk region? You attack Latvia. You've got Kaliningrad right here, this chunk right here on the Baltic. This is Russia. Kaliningrad right here is a Russian oblast that is not connected to Russia. It is bordered to the north by Lithuania.
Moron, that's Lithuania. That's not Latvia. Why would you attack Latvia? What?
Lithuania, and to the south by Poland. They could launch an incursion from Kaliningrad into Lithuania.
Well, I thought you said they were going to attack Latvia. Okay, see, this is the thing that confuses me. Because when you actually war game a Russian offensive in Europe, which right now is being talked about more, but Russia is not really in the military state of mind to conduct such a thing. It can barely guard its own borders, let alone engage in offensive operations at Latvia. The idea is there's this little strip of land between Lithuania, Belarus, and Kaliningrad that if they can, in between Vilnius in this area, that if they were to make this gap, then they could cut off Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And so much of NATO defense planning is about how to plug this gap. But the problem is now, though, is that's not the only border that Russia has with NATO. It also has the Finnish border, which they've taken 80% of their troops off of, which is context you would probably want to include, considering St. Petersburg is not too far away from Helsinki. It's part of the reason Stalin invaded Finland back in the 30s and 40s, is because he didn't like how close Finland was to the city of St. Petersburg. So I just... even if we were to cross this gap, this does not destroy Russia's security threat from NATO. Like, NATO could, they have double the border size now. And again, how would they even conduct this operation at this moment? And why would it be Latvia, not Lithuania? Or did he just mean Lithuania and he said Latvia? Whatever.
In fact, they could attack Lithuania from the south and Latvia from the east.
Why would they attack Lithuania and they would attack just whatever. I'm not gonna general.
It'd be a massive expansion, but it would force Ukraine or NATO to reassess.
Why would you? What? I'm sorry. Okay. Why would Ukraine reassess? Are you kidding? Could you imagine you're President Zelensky? Okay. You're okay. No. I'll be President Zelensky for a moment. Okay. I'll roleplay it President Zelensky for just a moment. Ring, 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 ring. Hello? Yes, servant of the people. 20 Emmys. I know. Oh, what's that? The Russians have decided to open a second front to the war that they're fighting. The war where they're currently not able to guard their own border? How many? Wait, oh, you mean 3 fronts, because they've invaded Latvia and Lithuania at the same time. Oh, and of course, Poland and Germany and every other NATO state has decided to declare war on Russia. Well, it's going to be a violent 72 to 100 hours, but okay, click. Why would they be angry? Why would they? Oh, I guess I got to give up my land because now it's all of Europe versus Russia. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe it would cause Europe to have a brief security crisis, but I don't think the result of that security crisis would be okay now that the overstretched Russian army has decided to cross into Lithuania and Latvia at the same time for some reason. I'll simplify and just say Lithuania amongst the gap that is, it's like strategic vulnerability, that NATO is going to say, okay, now's the moment to secede, give up Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which is what the move would be for. Doesn't make any sense. Toyota Corolla, thank you so much for the $4.99. Tim Pool, don't you mean dumb tool? Wow. We've got some big brain. This is so scratchy, and this does not fit me. I'm going to take this off as we continue, but my God. Brilliant, brilliant minds over at the Timcast.
Now, I don't know that Russia could handle by itself going up against all of the Western powers.
Yeah, you don't know? Yeah, okay, let me clarify it for the people with a lack of knowledge. God, this is tight. They can't. They can't. The Russians are currently redeploying air defense systems from eastern Russia and redeploying troops from Kaliningrad, trying to keep the Ukrainians at bay. They are taking tanks that haven't seen service since Khrushchev and rolling them into service. They do not have the armor to continue supporting armored operations across all their offensive actions, and so are relying on a lot of infantry attacks. Them hoisting a bunch of new armored assault units into existence to engage in mass armored mechanized warfare across all of Europe, when they can't even manage not even combined arms warfare in Ukraine. It doesn't make any sense. There's the threat of just amount of damage that could be done, of course, but when you say you don't know how it would end one of two ways. It would end with the world burnt, Russia destroyed, and then that's terrible, and we're just all dead, or just or equivalent to all of our societies just very heavily damaged, or, you know, one of us backs down. And why would we back down if we're the one with the bigger army and nuclear arsenal, and we're the one standing in traffic, and it's the Russians that are driving at us full force? It just, why would the Russians agree to do that? It doesn't make any sense.
The question then becomes...
I'm getting tripped up by it because I'm trying to understand the logic, but what did my grandma used to say? Can't make sense of nonsense.
How does Turkey handle this? The question then becomes, what does China think? Russia's huge. If China enters the fray, joining Russia, taking Taiwan, splitting U.S. forces, welcome to World War III. Not to mention, we've already got a crisis in the Middle East. You've got the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea attacking shipping lanes. Saudi Arabia, Yemen. You've got Iran.
These, you know what, Tim? I didn't think about it that way before. That was really deep. Those are a bunch of distinct political entities, terrorist groups, militaries, and nations. He just basically said, here's this one distinct geopolitical conflict. And then when you go to Asia, there's a separate one. And then when you go to the Middle East, more conflict. He didn't the point I assume he's trying to make is that the United States is overstretched. That we have assets in the Middle East, that we have assets in Europe, and that we have assets in Asia, and trying to manage all these assets at the same time is going to be impossible. But the point of American power right now is to be able to fight like 2 wars at the same time on 2 separate continents. At least that's the goal that the military is striving for, to be able to defend Europe, be able to defend Asia, to some extent one way or the other. Now, doing that alone as the United States is basically impossible. But if you rely on local alliances, which is a big reason why it has been a bipartisan concern for NATO to increase spending, then it might be possible, it might be plausible. And that's what they're trying to build in Europe. That's what they're trying to build, some version of that in Asia. In the Middle East, a lot of this is being contracted out to the Israelis and the Saudis. But yeah, just the idea that, for example, there's a war between Israel and Lebanon. Guess we have to end support. I mean, Israel and Hezbollah. I guess we have to end support for Ukraine. I don't think that logic really applies. But maybe he means all these forces are going to strike at the same time in the coordinated fashion. He's saying that's possible. Which, I mean, they could do it in an uncoordinated fashion where they just take advantage of the moment as well. But, I mean, the Chinese have their own distinct problems. If you war game out Chinese invasion scenarios of Taiwan, there's a few problems here if you're China and you're trying to win right now. Number one, most scenarios where you war game it out, if the United States is allowed to use Japanese military bases, it doesn't end well for them. So there's scenarios where they're probably gaming it out. And even if it's not as bad as the American gaming scenarios, there's probably a few where they don't win. I mean, think about the problems that the Russians face trying to invade Ukraine. And now you've got to establish a bridgehead in Taiwan, cross over, don't get hit by USVs, don't get hit by UAVs, don't get hit by sea mines and anti-ship missiles. Establish a bridgehead, support the bridgehead, supply the bridgehead, expand the bridgehead, do this all under fire, do this all under pressure. And it's the first time the Chinese have had like a major military engagement since what? Vietnam? And we know that there's corruption problems in the Chinese military. How deep? No one really knows. But the point is that the idea that there's other factors involved that are probably restricting the Chinese from taking the moment right now, as well as the fact that China has a lot of economic issues that would be heartily intensified if they were to start a war in the South China Sea, where a good amount of world trade passes through, and the amount of sanctions that would be generated from the United States. I mean, China's having a problem getting its consumers to consume. And the loss of foreign consumers at this moment in time, when it has its own industrial problems, has its housing problems, has its own consumer problems, has its own problems when it comes to local governments and excessive amounts of debt, there's other forces at play stopping the Chinese from just brazenly stumbling into war. All I'm saying is that, to me, when I see Tim Pool doing this doesn't seem like he's looking at the big picture necessarily, less than he's just naming a bunch of places and things, and you're supposed to assume a bunch of chaos or a bunch of potential catastrophes and be like, oh, these are all things that are possible, which is true. But when you don't talk about all the factors involved, you could start catastrophizing.
Things are heating up. And I think that I fear. I don't know. I fear we will have full-scale war before the election.
With what? Wait, with who? He just named like 3 separate. Number one, there's already full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine. Okay, it's kind of harder to go. It's kind of hard to go less full-scale than the full. It's called the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's how historians refer to it. You've got the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then you've got the full-scale invasion because they removed any like illusion of local separatism, etc., etc. So I guess he's maybe talking about the Middle East, which it is possible that a war could spiral out there. But if he means Taiwan, I mean, honestly, it doesn't seem like tensions are that escalated at the moment. The Chinese have a lot of other problems. It's not impossible the Chinese might want to divert from some of their domestic problems with a foreign military excursion. They wouldn't be the first regime to do so. But I mean, we don't see any real rumblings around that. The closest was that Nancy Pelosi moment, and nothing really came of that. I think they have a bunch of incentives to not shake the boat at the moment too. So I assume he means the Middle East, because he can't mean Ukraine and Russia because it's already full-scale war. Unless he means full-scale war with all of Europe, which wouldn't make sense for the Russians to do that.
I mean, I feel like it would result in Trump winning, but this is their fail-safe. The military-industrial complex, they call it, wants the war. If Donald Trump becomes president and the war is already on, it will be very, very difficult to stop. And
which war? He just said full-scale war, and then didn't clarify which full-scale war we're talking about, what potential full-scale war, and now he's just referring to what war?
Trump may
There's already one full-scale war.
No choice but to say, we're going to see this through. We can't stop now. I think Trump will attempt to bring peace. But I do believe that Democrats will try to make this war happen before anyone can change office.
What war? If they're talking about the Middle East, Joe Biden desperately does not want a war between Israel and Lebanon. You might critique him for not doing everything he could to prevent it if you think he could take a different diplomatic approach. Putting it on that side, he doesn't want it. He doesn't want it because he knows the possible electoral implications of that spiraling out while he's in the White House. He probably doesn't want it to spiral out in the first place. He doesn't want the effect on international markets, messing with the economy. We have American soldiers in the region that he doesn't want to put in risk or in danger under more missile attacks. We've already lost some soldiers in the region under his presidency. I mean, so he can't be referring to the Middle East. If he's talking, and he can't be referring to Ukraine because that's already a full-scale war. And if he's referring to Taiwan, I just don't see the escalatory potential. So is he referring to that Democrats want a full-scale war in all of Europe? Because it can't be the Middle East, and full-scale war in Taiwan doesn't make any sense. So is he saying Democrats want Germany and Poland to invade and capture Kursk?
Speaking on CBS's Face the Nation, the Arizona Democrat said 130,000 Russians have had to leave their homes. At this point in the conflict, I think the Ukrainians did something unpredictable that could really change the tide of how this conflict is going to play out. At the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were fears that if Ukraine and its allies expanded into Russian territory, a regional or global conflict could break out. The war, however, has largely settled into a stalemate, at least.
This is the problem. Okay, if I was in Tim's shoes, this would be the problem I would face. The tanks were supposed to be a red line to some. The jets were supposed to be a red line. The long-range weapons were supposed to be a red line. Striking over the border into Russia was supposed to be a red line. Hell, even the occupied Ukrainian territory was supposed to be a red line.
John Brown Enthusiast has donated $5. I'm pretty sure the Mike is quite happy with the payments through Ukraine and Israel, as full-scale war is bad for the Mike. Corruption. Since projects get cancelled as quick as they are green.
Oh, and not to mention, if it's full-scale war across all of Europe, the military-industrial complex, one of the things that have stopped investment in Ukraine's military-industrial complex, even though Rheinmetall has just agreed to some investments, is that they don't want their investments to be blown up. It's probably safer to build your weapons in a country that's not being bombed and then sell them to countries being bombed than to build your weapons in countries being bombed to then have them be used in the country being bombed, where the company and manufacturer could be blown up. And so I would say that if you're the CEO of Rheinmetall and there's war in Europe, I mean, that puts your, headquarters in extreme danger. Hell, the CEO of Rheinmetall was almost assassinated by the Russians recently, or at least there was a plot that was dissembled. I don't know how far along the plot really was. I don't want to insinuate something that isn't true. Point is, though, like, I don't know if necessarily all of them would want full-scale war everywhere. I mean, maybe some military companies would, but I think there'd be a lot of European ones that'd be absolutely terrified. But yeah, nothing that would destroy their ability to get future interest. Like, if they had full-scale nuclear war, kind of hard to sell weapons to dead people. You want to be able to have returning customers.
Unpredictable that could really change the tide of how this conflict is going to play out. At the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were fears that if Ukraine and its allies expanded into Russian territory, a regional or global conflict could break out. The war, however, has largely settled into a stalemate, at least until Ukraine...
I mean, but after so many red lines being crossed, if you're Tim Pool, how do you say this red line mattered for this reason? That's what I would be looking for. If I was Tim, I'd be looking for something like that. Like, this red line is different because it was the standard that they've held since the 90s and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now that this has been crossed, here's a signal we can look to. But there's not much because the Russians have done everything they can to play it down. So if anything, it feels like the Ukrainians crossed the red line and then the Russians tried to block the cameras from seeing the fact that they did so. I mean, another example of this is Ukrainian journalists or any journalists that go into Russia and reporting in Sudza, they're being listed as wanted by the Russians, and the Russians are trying to arrest them. Hey, Waves, thank you so much for the subarino, buddy. Thank you for the tier 2 sub, Grandmaster Walrus. I appreciate it. I thought I said Waves. And so let me ask you something. Why would it be illegal under Russian law, according to them, for CNN journalists to go to Sudza, which is in Russia, and film because they're filming within Russia and that's illegal? But it's not illegal for them to go to Kramatorsk and film if the Russians have Kramatorsk as part of Donetsk, as part of Russia's recognized territory in their constitution. Another example of the Russians treating occupied Ukrainian territory differently than territory that is internationally Russian, that is internationally recognized as Russian.
Ukraine's forces crossed into the Kursk region in Russian territory. It's simple. Low-yield tactical nukes. Russia is not going to tolerate its city being evacuated.
It did it for Sudza, it did it for Koronevo. It's doing it for other cities right now. It's doing it for everything that's south of the river that had just had the rivers, all the bridges blown up. I think it's the Selm. It's to the east of, to the west of the incursion in the Kursk. I mean, 130,000, 150,000 people have already been evacuated. Probably going to escalate to like 200,000 more, possibly. But they're doing it anyway. I mean, they just announced it. They're not going to tolerate it. And then you're showing me an article on screen that's talking about the evacuations. I mean, I remember people saying this when the Russians had to leave Kherson. They're not going to tolerate evacuating Kherson after announcing it as part of Russia. And now we're all the way to Kursk. If it's better for the regime's survival from the perspective of the regime, it might make more sense to try to use Kursk as basically... from their perspective, the place where the Ukrainians break their bayonet. Less than the place where the Russians start the apocalypse.
How long until Russia says 100 kilotons? We'll keep it small. End Kiev. That ends the war overnight. I don't know.
How did that end the war overnight? How do you... So the West is just like, oh my God, they used a nuke. Okay, we're going to do nothing now. You win, Russia. All it took was one instance of nuclear terrorism, and now we secede. You get all of Ukraine, and in fact, you do that in Moldova, next you get Moldova too. You do it anywhere, you get anything. I'm sure this will have no impact on how the Kim regime thinks. I'm sure this will have no impact on how any other regime thinks. The Western policymakers, as much as I give them sometimes less credit, because I don't think they deserve the credit all the time, it would be impossible for them to see, to miss the downstream impacts geopolitically of setting that standard and taking that sledgehammer to the cause of international nuclear non-proliferation. And doing it to the country that gave its nukes up to the Russians as well. And gave them the delivery devices along with it, which they've already launched at Ukraine.
we'll see that we see that right away. I think what we see first is likely going to be low-yield nuclear artillery.
Likely. He's saying this is likely? This is likely? This isn't like, here is a scenario of something that might happen we should take a look out for. He's saying this is a likely scenario. There's been no reports on the Russians preparing this. There's been no... By the way, let me just throw this out here. It's not that nuclear artillery is impossible, right? Now, there's the problem with, of course, international sanction. There's the problem with, of course, even their allies not being happy with it. There's the problem with, of course, more Western aid possibly being funneled into Ukraine as a response, or Western troops getting involved. There's all these other problems that go along with it. But how about this? You have your nuclear artillery shells next to your D-30 or whatever nuclear, delivery device you would have. I guess it wouldn't be a D-30. And then an FPV drone hits it with all of the nuclear devices. Or what about any of the other complications that can come with trying to deliver a nuclear weapon? There's also like an amount of, on top of all of the other negative impacts, there's a level of risk that the Russians will be taking on by delivering those over there. And to Kursk, who's going to operate those? Is it going to be the conscripts that are going to operate those weapons? Because it's the conscripts that are doing a lot of the fighting. And they don't like to give the conscripts necessarily the best equipment. I guess it would be some of the redeployed troops. But I mean, he's saying this is likely, not here is something that is like last ditch. No, this is what they're doing. This is a likely scenario. I bet this is going to happen. And so when this doesn't happen, and they don't use these, and it doesn't happen before the election that we have a big war, is there going to be any reflection from Tim Pool? Is there going to be any reflection on how he views foreign policy, or how he talks about these stories, or about the conclusions he jumps to?
Flattening the eastern region of Ukraine, just wiping out some key areas. If Russia,
it honestly sounds like Sony of like, well, any day now, well, nukes in Kramatorsk, any day.
Russia uses,
I mean, it's not impossible for them to use it. It's just when he says it's likely and then doesn't talk about why it's likely, and there's no expert I know or anybody that I'm talking to that are in the know that are saying that this is likely to happen, but somehow Tim Pool has figured it out. Yeah, I'm gonna look at him with a raised eyebrow.
Any kind of actual higher yield nuclear weapon, then it's World War III and they know it. But I don't know that it matters anymore. This is psychotic. Ukraine is the enemy of this country. Ukraine is our enemy, being funded by the Democrats. I will stress this again. One of the greatest enemies of our nation right now is Ukraine. They are expanding this war. Now, don't get me wrong. I know you've got criminal elements of the U.S. government pushing them and guiding them and telling them what to do. Ukraine is now accused, a German warrant issued for blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, triggering this conflict. Ukraine is the greatest threat to this nation and to the world.
Okay, I'm sorry. I let it go on for a bit. I let him spew it for a bit. But Ukraine is the greatest threat to this nation and to the world. This is what happens when all of your journalisms is dependent on hyperbolic rhetoric. Is that you got to dump stuff like this out there. That Ukraine is the enemy, just like slamming the table. They're the enemy. Okay, so putting aside just like the whiny performative nonsense here, which I'm just gonna put it to the side and ignore it, because I mean we can laugh at it, we can giggle at it. We can see like, oh my God, I can't believe that this country would invade the largest nation on the planet. Oh my God, the largest nation on the planet just wanted a little bit more land. He just wanted a little bit more land. Come on, can't the largest nation on the planet be a little bit large? Okay, putting all that aside. Number one, Democrat funded. I don't know if you guys remember this, but the original aid packages were majority Democrat and Republican funded. Democrats vote for it overwhelmingly. There's not any Democrats to vote against aid, but a lot of Republicans ended up voting for it too, even last time around, even if not the majority, still a decent amount. And the majority of Americans support aid to Ukraine. You can call it Democrat funding if you want, but you got to say bipartisan funded. That's the sentence you're looking for, Tim. If they're the Democrats, so it's the Democrats that they're the Democrat. It's bipartisan funded, but the Democrats are the ones that are the most united on the issue. My goodness, that Ukraine is the enemy. Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons to not seem provocative to the Russians, and then Tim talks about the Russians using those nuclear weapons and other nuclear weapons on Ukraine and on the West, kind of casually, without explaining the logic. And he doesn't see the problem here when he then calls the nation that gave up its nuclear weapons at our request the enemy of the United States and of the world. It gives up its nuclear weapons, its nuclear arsenal, during the Budapest Memorandum. It gives it up to Russia, its main potential threat, at the request of the United States, because we wanted to concentrate these nukes in one location, because we were scared of all these different post-Soviet nuclear arsenals being scattered everywhere, getting traded around by corrupt generals. And so Ukraine made that sacrifice in return for us coming to their defense in this exact scenario. And then this exact scenario plays out, and Tim's response is they're the enemy when they made those security sacrifices in part because of our insistence. And then we don't appreciate the security sacrifices the Ukrainians made as the generations that grew up or came up after the Cold War. And so even in the pro-Ukraine sphere, or at least when you look at the news about the war and people are talking about it, like, this history is not like a leading argument. It's like, if you get really into it, you listen to Timothy Snyder, Budapest Memorandum. But it's quite annoying. It's quite sad. And this is just, wasn't this guy working for Vice?
We should rescind all funding and financing, pull out all military support, and we should apologize to Russia.
Come on. We should apologize to... We're sorry that you started the largest war in Europe since World War II, and we uncovered the largest mass graves in Europe since the Yugoslav genocide. We're really sorry we spent the time to uncover those. We're really sorry that we didn't do anything when you invaded Crimea, really, and we kind of ignored your shadow war in the Donbass. And then you escalated to the big level, and we do nothing for the first few months. Then you fall on a rake, we push back, and now we're the big escalators. Oh my goodness. Can I also say, when he talks about Ukrainian escalation, can I just say, I am so sick, and the problem is, that a lot of these alt media spaces are kind of insular, they're kind of like bubbles. When we talk about escalation, it's always in the context of Ukraine. Why isn't Tim Pool talking about the Russian invasion in the Kursk? I went and reported on that on the ground. And that invasion was stiff. It was tough. It was brutal. They moved forward, and I mean, look at Volchansk now. Look at Lipsy now. There's no buildings left. Was that not an escalation and expansion of the war when they're opening up new fronts? Was that not an escalation? Was the bombing of a children's hospital not escalation? Why do we only talk about an escalation when it's the Ukrainians doing stuff like this? It's not only a Tim problem, it's a Crystal and Sagar problem, so it's a breaking points more generally problem. It's a problem of a lot of alt media commentary. It's even a problem of some mainstream commentary. And I'm not saying don't talk about it, because in a sense it is an escalation for the Ukrainians to cross over the border. But when you just talk about it in isolation, then all you're doing is showing one perspective of the war, while like slamming the mainstream media for being like, you know, looking at a war from the pro-West Ukrainian binoculars.
Vladimir Putin's a bad guy. Not a good dude, don't like him. But for what reason are we now allowing Ukrainian forces to invade Russia? Russia's only recourse.
Listen to how... Is this just a Western? I don't want to bash my own fellow Westerners too much. Is this like an American thing? Is this a Westerner thing? I don't know what it is. But this, like, how could we allow this? How could we allow the Ukrainians to fight the Russians in Russia? They should be fighting over the ruins of Ukrainian homes, not Russian homes. They should be fighting over the corpse of Arihiv, or the corpse of Volchansk, or the corpse of Lipsy, or the corpse of Popasna, or the corpse of Liman. They should not be fighting over the corpse of Sudza. It doesn't matter if you can find some military justification. It doesn't matter if you can find some strategic justification. Anything that advanced the war. Just, no, it has to be within the confines of Ukraine. Why? Why is that? It'd be one thing if we were directing it And then the United States was directly advising and or pushing forward and managing an invasion of Russia itself, not occupied Ukraine, but Russia, then that'd be one thing. But we found no evidence of that. We haven't found any evidence that we have assisted. I mean, we haven't changed our long strike rules for this invasion. We haven't done any intelligence sharing from the reports that I've seen for this invasion. So if we're not the ones assisting them in it, why would our approval matter? That, I mean, clear communication's one thing, but the last time I'm going to be honest, the Jack Textera leaks, the leaks that Jack Textera, the National Guardsman who leaked all that stuff on that stupid Discord channel, that kind of hangs high over the heads of Ukrainian commanders who are scared about plans getting out. Not to mention that who knows if they would have approved it. Was it the United States' place to approve it? Point is, though, the operation broke through. They have some Russian territory now, and we didn't experience nuclear Armageddon. And the red line that was written was a lot blurrier than at first imagined. Now, you could say, hey, it was still reasonable for us to acknowledge the red line and operate around it out of just risk management. Even if that risk didn't end up playing out, risk management could have still been the reasonable and rational approach. You can make that argument, but post-fact, you cannot continue to say, oh my gosh, crossing this red line was, World War III, World War III, World War III. Calm down a little bit and reassess the situation. Look how the Russians are approaching it. Why are the Russians downplaying it?
If they lose, the Kursk region is going to be just carpet bombing Ukraine. They cannot win, but by the graces of Russia does Ukraine continue.
Oh, no. Nah, come on. Nah, man. By the graces of Russia does Ukraine continue? Dude, who is this? This dude worked for Vice. It is, honestly speaking, it is embarrassing that Vice has any association with this man whatsoever. It is by the graces of Russia that Ukraine continues. 3 days. 3 days. The graces of Russia. He doesn't argue it. He just throws it out there. The Russians have been trying everything they can to submit the Ukrainians. First, they wanted to take the whole country. When that failed, then they wanted to take all of the Donbass in a big sweep. Then that didn't work, so they made smaller and smaller encirclements and pronged attacks before inching forward. It's been almost 3 years now, and oh my God. It's like, God, man, how many final forms does Russia have? Oh, Ukraine, how dare you hit the Kerch Bridge? Now you're triggering Russia's final form. Kamehame. And now 3 months later, it's like, oh my God, did you just strike so-and-so oil refinery? Well, that's the last one, Ukraine. I'm going into Form 4. And how many times are we going through these theatrics before we say, actually, Russia is pushing its capacity to as much as its political circumstance will allow, and it's hesitant to continue mobilization because of how unpopular it would be, and it has financial constraints. Financial constraints that stop it from just taking everything and throwing it to only the war effort. It'd be one thing to say that Russia has more wiggle room. It could mobilize more and have political repercussions. It could mobilize more. But this idea that Russia is just sitting back and any day it could be okay, Ukraine, it's time to discipline you into the Ruski Mir. And then the tech, they got the mechas come out and they've got the robot arms and boom, boom, laser beams. Deus Machina, that's not happening. You want to know what their Deus Ex Machina is? It's tanks from the Stalin era, okay? So it's not happening. It's not that Russia can't do a lot of damage. It's, for example, Lancets can do a lot of damage. Caliber missiles have done a lot of damage. We just saw what long-range Russian missiles can do to the Children's Cancer Hospital. But this idea that they've got some secret super weapon in reserves that they're just waiting to deploy, and they're not deploying it because Russians are just such good souls. They're just such good people. It's ridiculous. It's silly.
because Russia has nukes.
Like, after your own soldiers march on your own capital, don't you think at that point you would stop playing around? Like, come on, like, after the Prigozhin coup, they're really gonna be like, nah, let's still hold back?
Russia is deciding not to flatten Ukraine. If Russia decides right now.
Okay, well, you could say that about, if they were to, like, drop nukes everywhere, then, I mean, I guess, yeah, technically by not nuking everything at once, they have decided not to flatten Ukraine. But also, there's going to be complications that come with that. Stuff can get shot down, you can end up nuking yourself, radiation spillover. But putting that aside, then we could just say the United States every day chooses not to flatten Russia. China every day chooses not to flatten Russia or the United States. Like, everybody chooses not to flatten everyone if they have nuclear weapons. And guess what? Ukraine has nuclear allies. And Russia's also depending on countries that don't want that nuclear standard to be degraded. So just saying this in isolation isn't giving anybody like a geopolitical insight. It's just like, it's fear-mongering. Like, it'd be one thing to talk about the risk of it. It's another thing to just talk about, like, oh, this is something that could happen. Oh, it's even likely. I would say this is even likely. And then you don't explain how it's likely. You don't explain the components of it. You don't go into any of the nuance. I mean, like, it's a 12-minute video, but, like, Tim's not doing anything that important. He can go off. He can do 20 minutes, 25 minutes. He can release one less music signal. Come on. He can do it.
That an invasion into their territory is too much, and so they decide to just carpet bomb or nuke Ukraine. It's over.
I'm sorry, like, when they, oh, one of these days they're gonna start really bombing Ukraine. Tim Pool's never been to Ukraine, but, like, have they seen, like, the Popasna ruins? Like, this is what, when you look over German cities at the end of World War II, this is what they look like. This is what German cities at the end of World War II look like. When you looked at all the destroyed villages after the Red Army and the Allies and the British, like, you know, they said bombs away to Dresden. This is what they look like. Now, that's not every single building in Ukraine, but that's, quite frankly, he can say it's Russia holding back. It's because they're not in range. Once you get in artillery range of the Russians, then your city's in real danger. And that's happened time again. Volchansk and Lipsy are just two perfect examples of it of recent memory. Also, the Russians don't have air superiority over Ukraine, so they couldn't even if they wanted.
Maybe that's what NATO wants. Justification for entering the war and scaling things up and starting World War III. World War III being the excuse by which they can rush into Russia, destroy their government.
What happens when none of this happens in the next, like, 6-7 months? And World War III doesn't happen. It's like, wow, we just missed it by a hair's breadth. We were that close. They had the nuclear artillery in the barrel.
Putin's in between a rock and a hard place. What's he going to do? Allow NATO to expand on its border? Literally invade?
Why? What? The United States doesn't want to blow up, and Russia doesn't want to blow up. They both have these mutual interests. They're both trying to play a game. Not play a game, but you get the idea. They're both trying to engage in a back and forth where they get to a point where they can support their side the most to achieve their goals without crossing that red line. That's why when there was a confrontation where an American drone was knocked down over the Black Sea, it was very hush-hush. And we didn't hear about it, and most people don't know about it because it was very hush-hush. Because we wanted to keep it hush-hush. And that's when Russian missiles accidentally crossing the Poland or accidentally crossing Romania, we don't hear a lot about it. Why do we not hear a lot about it? Because we don't want that type of a confrontation. If we just were looking for an opportunity, Tim, we don't need to manifest a new Franz Ferdinand to get shot. We can just look at any of the times the Russian missiles hits NATO territory in Romania. Or we could talk about the drone getting knocked out. We just wait for any of those instances. But every time those instances come up, both sides divert, which leads me to believe that no sides wants a larger nuclear confrontation. A serious nuclear confrontation.
Its territory? It did. Will China intervene on behalf of Russia? Things are getting crazy.
They won't. There's your answer. They will not. The Chinese will go towards their own interests, and if the Russians can help them do that by, for example, trying to have a new Siberian pipeline that is of much cheaper import prices for the Chinese, then yeah, they'll work with the Russians on that. If it means, you know, working on challenging US dollar, yeah, they'll work with them on that. But the Chinese are not going to be invading Ukraine. They're going to help them maybe with like CNC machines and other stuff that they need to perpetuate the war. But the Chinese are not going to like coordinate military strikes to try to like overpower Ukraine. And right now they have a bunch of other issues that are not being considered here when talking about the possibility of trying to start a war in Taiwan. And let's say they did start a war with Taiwan. Let's just throw this out there. The United States isn't in Ukraine. We're not fighting in Ukraine. We're sending Ukraine aid. But if there was a war with Taiwan, the threat would be of American direct involvement, which is a different scenario than just like sending over aid. Even though there is an aid inflow into Taiwan right now to dissuade a possible Chinese invasion.
At first, we heard that the Ukrainians were firing rockets into this region. And they said it's because Russians were attacking them from this territory. Now they've invaded and triggered an evacuation. On Sunday, host Margaret Brennan asked Kelly if he was comfortable with American weapons being used on Russian soil. I am at this point, Kelly said. The Ukrainians were illegally attacked by Vladimir
Kelly
Putin.
is the astronaut senator from Arizona. He's very pro-Ukraine. He was very pro the F-16 program. He was also one of the potential Kamala Harris VP picks, but didn't end up getting chosen.
Putin. He's intentionally killing women, children, old people. It was an illegal invasion. Illegal? It's an invasion.
Who is Tim Pool? Wasn't he supposed to be in like Libya or something? Didn't he, like, or was it Tunisia? Didn't he do like some foreign affairs reporting with Vice? Yeah, yes, there can be different international standards, and Mark Kelly is referring to the UN standards. And for example, an invasion, for example, of a country that is under UN sanction after there's been a UN approved mission, or for example, let's say if a country invades you and then you defend yourself and then you push them back and then you invade back to destroy the weapons. Like, yes, there's legal and illegal ways to engage in warfare. There's things like war crimes, and then there's not war crimes. Shooting your enemy that's attacking you, not a war crime. Shooting a POW, war crime. Or would you just say to that, illegal, not illegal? It's war. Yeah, you can engage in war for reasons that are legal for defensive purposes, for example, in the international community, or illegal, for example, you know, wars of aggression. And there's even invasions that could be legal under under certain international sanction. For example, like an invasion to stop like a terrorist threat, or let's say there's a UN mission, etc.
Incursion. And let's characterize it.
They have to be under UN sanction and stuff, of course. But point is, yes, there is a distinction between legal and illegal.
That way for now. I don't think the Ukrainians want to intentionally hold Russian territory for a long period of time. But this really set Putin back on his heels. No, it didn't. Putin's allowing it to happen. That's the reality. He's allowing it to happen. I will stress this again.
Wait, okay, so, oh my God, we're on the brink of World War III, but then Putin's also allowing it. So Putin wants World War III? Or is he allowing World War III? He wants the circumstances that would bring World War III? Because if they would have just stopped the Ukrainians at the border, then that would have avoided the whole shindig altogether. And it also would have been a big, well, it could have been some propaganda victory. Where this is a propaganda loss, having to you don't want to have to evacuate 150,000 people. You don't want to have to deploy your conscripts that are not even well trained enough in this warfare, did not sign contracts for stuff like this, and their mothers are going to be much more angry if something happened to them because they didn't sign a $3,000 to $4,000 a month contract. The idea that he allows it, no, the Ukrainians broke through, they poured in troops, Putin faced the dilemma, and the dilemma was continue the pressure on Pokrovsk or redeploy to push the Ukrainians over the border sooner rather than later, if they can at all. And he chose to keep the pressure on Pokrovsk when trying to use all his other resources possible to slow down the advances. That's what he chose to do. It's not that he allowed it, it's that he's in a dilemma and this is the best he could manage. If he allowed it, then that would be embarrassing because this is the largest invasion of Russia since the Second World War. And I don't think a man who cares so much about history and legacy like Vladimir Putin, who rants about it endlessly when talking to Tucker about it, is going to want to be known as somebody who let Russia be invaded.
At any point, Vladimir Putin could scale up the weapons that he's using, and he can say, 10 kilotons, flatten this region. Not Kursk.
They're already using giant cob bombs, giant glide bombs, but he's talking about the nuclear bombs, which, I mean, again, like, he hasn't made the argument for it. He's just saying, oh, they could do it at any moment, and he's not talking about the potential consequences. This would be like, you know, at any moment, I could take this shotgun, and I could go find the most evil business person of evilness, and then I could go show him one, two, and three about screwing over the poor. But if I talk about, like, the possibility of doing that without including legal repercussions, getting arrested by the police, like, like, if they have kids or not, if kids are going to be here, like, you're not really talking about it. It almost feels like fantasizing. Almost like this is like a type of disaster news. I don't want to call it erotica. Maybe this is like the Sears catalog of doomsday.
Flatten, I don't know, Donetsk? What are we looking at?
Oh, they're going to flatten the city of Donetsk. Okay. The Russians are going to flatten the cities they already occupy. That makes sense. Okay.
Where they're invading from, here's Kursk, from Sumy. Flatten them. He can literally just flatten the rural areas outside of it.
He's going to flatten the rural areas. They've been flattening the rural areas for already. What war has he been tuning into? What war? What war is he? Oh, the Russians are going to blow up the rural communities. It is the rural communities that get decimated the most and get, like, annihilated, and there's nothing left. Rural community after rural community. Villages of like 100 people that will never, that many of which will never be rebuilt. It's like Tim is like, oh my God, he's going to do this thing that they've already, oh my God. It really is like it's the stereotypical Putin's about to get serious. Putin might start bombing civilians. Putin might start committing war crimes. Putin might start targeting cities. Putin might start targeting electrical infrastructure. Putin might start targeting heating. Putin might start bombing a hospital. It's like, where have they been?
He can destroy any means by which vehicles could transport through, and he can say, cut them off. Tactical or nuclear artillery.
Tactical or nuclear artillery. What is that? What does that even mean? What? Tactical nuclear artillery or tactical artillery destroying a road, which you'd have to be in range of the artillery to do that, Tim. Or is there like a difference? Does he think there's like a tactical nuclear artillery and then there's just a nuclear artillery? I don't know what he means. I think he got tactical nuclear weapons. A little confused. There are tactical nuclear, whatever. I don't want to. There are tactical nuclear weapons that aren't artillery, and I think he just messed up the grammar. But again, he's not talking about any of the repercussions or the things. Because okay, the immediate ask from anybody hearing something like this should be, okay, Tim, why haven't they done it yet? Why haven't they done it yet, Tim? It's been almost a month since the Ukrainians invaded Kursk. In 10 days, it'll be a month. Why haven't they done it yet? Why not yet? Why haven't we heard any word of it? Why have there not been any reports about them preparing it? Why haven't they threatened it? Because it'd make more sense for them to threaten it, try to get the West to back off, instead of just immediately doing it. Because I think diplomatic pressure using these for diplomatic pressure would be the smart thing to do, instead of immediately barreling into a situation that's going to have negative, detrimental economic consequences for your country, and possibly strategic consequences. So the first question anyone should ask is, Tim, why haven't they done it yet?
I mean, the reality is this, my fear. Vladimir Putin nukes Kiev with a 100-kiloton bomb and says it ends today. The people of Russia won't tolerate this. But I got to tell you, there's another reality here. Putin,
the one the rest of us live on,
may be very happy that they invaded Kursk. It's going to...
What planet is he living on? He's excited that Russia's invaded for the first time since World War II. And that's why they're suppressing all the news about it, because he's so excited about it.
Allow him to
You know the videos I'm most excited about are the ones that I flag and try to get taken off YouTube.
Mobilize a war effort. He may be sitting back being like, thank God they finally did it. Now he goes on TV and says, NATO, the United States, through Ukraine, have attacked and invaded our country, displacing 130,000 people. He might then say, my fellow Russians, you must mobilize. We need weapons manufacturing. We need resources. We need food. The war has been brought to us. If you sit back, the West will destroy us.
What do you mean? I thought Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea was already Russia. Or does he also acknowledge the difference? Okay. So this is a scenario I've heard some people talk about, but I just want to ask this question. The first time Putin tried to mobilize people, it was the only time you saw his popularity take a real big hit. And it's edged down a little bit by little bit as time's gone on, but it hasn't taken a big hit like that again. Is Putin willing to do that right now? Is Putin willing to do that right now? Because if he is, why hasn't he? And the longer he waits, like if he waits 6 months until after Kursk to mobilize, hasn't he kind of lost the momentum? It's hard to, on one hand, downplay it, but then on the other hand, say, it's so bad we have to mobilize. It's not a crisis. But I need your children. I need your children and I need guns. But it's not a crisis. But get guns! Like, it's kind of hard to balance that out. I don't know. But, I mean, this is one possible scenario. Yes, that they could use this to try to rally more people. But whether or not they're going to use it to just get like a few more thousand people from Kursk, or to mobilize the hundreds of thousands of individuals necessary for them to engage in anywhere close to what Tim Pool's talking about, that's a totally different scenario.
And this is going to ignite the people of Russia. This may be what Putin was hoping for. So then, with the mass mobilization, they go in and crush Ukraine.
Russia just got invaded. Here's how this is a W for them. It feels... It'd be one thing if he was like, look, this could end up like hurting the Ukrainians because of the pressure that they're taking right now in Pokrovsk. Those troops could be elsewhere. There's real arguments you could make about how this could end up. Putin doesn't want to be humiliated. He doesn't want to be humiliated. He's not happy about this. But you could make arguments as to how the Russians taking this on the chin and just going, while it's going to hurt, keeping the pressure on Pokrovsk makes more sense for trying to win the Donbass in the long term. You could make that argument. Tim Pool doesn't know enough about the situation to make that argument. And so instead, this is the argument he makes. Which is weaker, but, I mean, it's something.
If it really did escalate to that point, I fear Putin would then bomb Kiev. You know why? Because ain't no European nation.
I love how 80 to 90% of this is pure speculation. 80 to 90% of this news report is pure speculation.
Would then bomb Kiev. You know why? Because ain't no European nation is going. What did they say? Which city was it in Poznan? I think it was. Might have been.
Poznan conference.
Some EU parliamentary member says
no. Okay.
No one is going to sacrifice New York for Poznan, Polish city. If Vladimir Putin really was
that was not it. I think he's and he took the wrong lesson from it too. Okay, wait, let him finish the argument, but then I'll tell you what the quote I believe it was. But there was different alliterations of the quotes. Maybe there's a Polish version of it I'm not familiar with.
Was it in Poznan? I think it was. Might have been. Some EU parliamentary member says no one is going to sacrifice New York for Poznan, Polish city. If Vladimir Putin really was to nuke a Polish city, there would be no dramatic mutually assured destruction escalation. If Putin were to attack Kiev with a 100 kiloton bomb, flattening city center, just decimating their center of central governance, is NATO really going to scale this up? I do think that if Putin were to drop a nuke on Ukraine, Democrats would be in trouble because a lot of people in this country are going to blame them.
Okay, so there's one thing. I love how on one hand, Russia, the weaker power with less military power than all of NATO combined, obviously, who's having trouble enough with Ukraine right now, the idea of them expanding the war is likely. The idea of them using nuclear weapons is likely. The idea that if that was to play out, that the West would actually respond, unlikely. Why? No explanation. Maybe it's because they're weak. Maybe it's because of our poor leadership. Maybe it's just Biden was asleep at the wheel. Whatever the explanation is. I just don't know why there's so different standards. There's so many different standards here. So the stories that I remember, it was about Berlin or it was about Paris. The idea was that during the Cold War, the argumentation that kept Stalin and other Soviet leaders from rolling over all of Europe into Soviet communism was the idea that if they were to invade, America would use its nuclear arsenal, France and the UK would use its nuclear arsenal, and it would obliterate its larger army of mechanized units, which for most of the Cold War in Europe, the Soviet Union had many more troops than the Allies, than NATO. So the idea was, if the United States was to start engaging in nuclear war, then it could lose New York. There's no way that the United States will lose New York for Paris or for Poznan in this instance, or for any other European state. Now, it doesn't make much sense for Poznan because, you know, I'm talking about this old Cold War saying that I think maybe someone rephrased and he reheard, because I remember it being from Paris. And so I think maybe this Polish parliamentarian rephrased it. But I would say the Cold War is proof. I mean, Berlin is a great example. Berlin, the Soviets like had it completely surrounded. We had the airlift, and they could have crushed it like physically. But the threat of our nuclear arsenal kept the Soviets from taking over Berlin. And so assuming that the Russians would so dismiss the idea of us using our own nuclear arsenal in response to keep a disincentive in place against the use of nuclear weapons in aggressive expansionist wars, or that we wouldn't use a physical kinetic response, or that the Chinese and the Indians wouldn't respond with financial repercussions because they don't have a disinterest. Like, I just think that he's assuming too much here, or leaning towards assuming too much here.
They're going to say Ukraine, if we did not support it, a country we have nothing to do with, Russia would have come in and taken.
We did have something to do with it. I mean, if we ask a country to give up its nukes and then we say we'll protect them if something happens, then we have something to do with the country. They sacrificed some of their security for everyone's security. And now that their security is threatened, now we jump out once we've already achieved our security priority, and theirs is still a question mark.
Taking the land bridge, that would be the end of it. The escalation's crazy, man.
Sorry, I didn't hear what he said. Let me go back.
A lot of people in this country are going to blame them. They're going to say Ukraine, if we did not support it, a country we have nothing to do with, Russia would have come in and taken the land bridge. That would be the end of it.
They say that, but we don't know that. We really do not know that. And I'm not going to assume that Tim Pool has it would have been the land bridge, because they have the land bridge now and the war's still going on. But the Russians said they wanted all of Ukraine. Why would it be that the Russians would stop at the land bridge and they wouldn't have just been like, okay, we'll try again in 2 years again? I mean, Putin said that Ukraine has to exist as an extension of Russia. Why does Putin's ideological belief that Ukraine has to exist as a part of Russia, why would he be like, no, all I wanted was the land bridge? And why would there not be any more, for example, resistance in occupied territory, which there still is? Just, I don't know. He's assuming too much. I don't like alternative history scenarios like being taken seriously, because it's impossible to really necessarily like boil it down and figure it out. But I particularly don't like it when they're talking about active wars where people are dying. Togo, thank you so much for the 6-month gift subscription. Courtesy. Oh no, Bob and Wap gifted that. Thank you.
The escalation's crazy, man. I don't know what else to tell you. Invasion? What invasion? Putin is downplaying Ukraine's Kursk offensive.
Oh, so he does know that they're doing that.
Atlantic Council. Warmongers.
He's actually fucking the dumbest man. He is the dumbest man in existence. How is he so stupid? This isn't like an opinion. This is just like something that's observable. It's observable. Like the orders down to the Telegram guys were to downplay it. The orders down to RT and the rest of the state media apparatus was to downplay it. They want to downplay it because Putin is supposed to be the stability candidate. He came in after the chaos of the 90s and provided stability and low food prices and otherwise to the Russian people. And now Russia is being invaded for the first time since World War II, and it's a serious threat where 130,000 to 200,000 people are being evacuated. Oh my God. And when it was only supposed to be a 3-day operation, downplay it. If they upplay it, while that might mean that they can beat the drums of war, and it'd be better for Tim Bull's, fear-mongering. But on the other end, politically speaking, it might actually damage Putin more, make him look weak. I don't know. Hey, JP, thank you for the 5 gifted. My goodness. Tier 2 memberships. You gifted 5 tier 2? Is that what I just saw?
Burns is an immoral.
Why, thank you very much. That is quite a lot. You didn't have to do that. I appreciate it. Man, that's wild though, man. Really?
Kelly added, since the invasion now for 2 years.
Really?
Morally
Like, it's just the Atlantic Council said this. The establishment people said that they're trying to downplay it. It can't really be that they're trying to downplay it. They're gonna pull out their Uno reverse card any moment now. Any moment now, Russia's gonna pull out their Uno reverse card. No, they're not. No, they're not. This might not end up being like the best strategy for Ukraine in the long run. We can't know. We'll have to see what it is. But I don't know why it's hard for him to believe, bankrupt man, why it's so hard for him to believe that there would be, you know, an incentive, a political incentive to play down a crisis. I mean, it's not like if I was to say like, hey, there's a nuclear disaster in some place in the United States and Biden played it down to cover it up. Everyone's like, of course, well, of course, like the Republicans be, of course they did that because Biden wants to cover it up because he doesn't want to get in trouble. The political logic would be simple from point A to point B. If he's unpopular, then that can come with consequences. Why would that not naturally extend to Putin? If Russia itself is not safe after almost 3 years of an anti-terrorism operation, anti-special military operation that was supposed to keep Russia safe, that's a problem. So them trying to downplay it or say, oh, it's going to be over quickly, isn't that why? I don't know why he like scoffed at that idea. This isn't even like a disputed thing. I guess he just pulled the Atlantic Council to be like, oh, it's the Atlantic Council saying it, so we don't have to take it seriously. But like, I mean, yeah.
Years ago, we have, you know, periodically, as we should reevaluate, you know, how we're going to conduct ourselves with regards to Ukraine. As soon as Ukraine invaded Russia, the U.S. should have cut off all funding. But the point is, Ukraine.
Why? Why would that be? Russia invades Ukraine for almost 3 years, and then Ukraine crosses the border, starts targeting strategic, like strategic assets, military assets, occupying land for a land trade, and we're supposed to say no. You must negotiate from a disadvantage, assuming that the purpose of the operation is to grab land for a trade.
Ukraine's a vassal state of the United States. Russia knows.
What do you? Why this removal of their sovereignty? Why this removal of their independent decision-making capacity to say, we want to be with the EU because we think it's better for our country, rather than with the Russian Eurasian security zone or economic zone? Why is it that that's vassalage to, as a smaller state, group up with these? I mean, under this framework, every single small state has to accept some vassalage if it wants to live anywhere with aggressive neighbors. But I mean, they would mostly call it alliances, but whatever.
We are being dragged into that war. I'll leave it there. Smash the like button, subscribe to this channel, share the show with your
Wow. Well, Tim didn't make a convincing argument. He didn't really make much of an argument at all. He mostly just read the article headlines, and then there's like a few quotes, and then fear-mongered a bunch, and then didn't leave any possible contradicting information, which there is much of. It is the lowest of the low when it comes to Ukraine reporting, because it's not really reporting. It's not even blogging. It's just fear-mongering.
At least we know PimTool is wrong consistently. Slava Ukraine, Ukraine.
Hey, thank you for the $5. I appreciate that, Jan. Thank you. Or G-Van? G-Van, I think. Okay, well, that's enough of Tim Pool.